Call this meeting of the Education Task Force to order. Madam Clerk, would you take the roll of the Senate?
Senator Agberry is present. Senator Hensley is present. Senator Powers is present. Senator White, Co-Chairman Lundberg
Here.
is present. Mr. Chairman, you have 4 Senate members present.
Thank you. Chair Lady Moody.
Will you please call the roll? Representative Reagan.
Here.
Representative Hill.
Here.
Representative Slater.
Here.
Representative Glenn.
Here.
Chairman Moody.
Here.
Chair Lady, you have 5 members present.
Thank you so much.
If you don't mind, I just wanted to go over a couple of things. For those in the audience, frankly, we are glad you're here, as well as members of the committee. If you've got signs, you're welcome to keep those. If you would, keep them below your face, so they're right here. You're doing just fine. Flash photography, we ask that you not pass the chairs here, and if you take those photographs and go back to your positions where you are. To the committee, just a personal order of my own personal privilege. Since the task force memo went out, my guess is you, like I, have had many emails and text messages and social media posts on how we're cutting education. And I want to say in this memo, there is nothing that tasks this group with cutting $1 of education funding. So, and there is no precursor to the outcome of what this committee is going to do, what this task force is going to do. And I think that's important as we go on with our discussion. I think the discussions we're going to have are going to be eye-opening, frankly, not only for us, but I think the citizens of Tennessee. And I think that's important. So that was it. Chair Lee?
Thank you, Chairman, and that was a good opening. And I thought I would just start by reading, again, some of you may have seen it and read it, but just for the record, what our task is. So the working group has been tasked with the responsibility to study the impact federal education funding has in and out of the classroom, the restrictions, mandates, and additional regulations required by the Federal Department of Education, and whether the state can provide similar services without taking federal dollars. Furthermore, we are directed to study, evaluate, analyze, and undertake a comprehensive review of federal education funding and its impact on the classroom, the curriculum, and attainment. So as you can imagine, that's quite a task and the time that we have, but we are grateful for comments, your interest in being here today. This isn't the easiest place to get to, so we are grateful for each one of you. And I guess I'll just keep going then. All right. So as you can see, we're pretty informal. We're used to being in committees, so we're trying to not be quite so formal, but serious. So today we will have 2 presentations that will begin our work on these matters, and we will hear from the Comptroller's Office of Research and Education Accountability and Fiscal Review. And we will take questions, members of the committee. We will take questions from you all once the presentation is completed. If you would like to get on the list in the meantime, you know how we do on the House side anyway. You can let our folks know that you would like to be put on the list. And the upcoming PowerPoints have been mailed to the House members of this working group, and copies are available. So members, do any of you have any personal orders or announcements before we begin? Seeing none, then we will get started. Will the Comptroller's Office, OREA as we call them, will you please come forward? We thank you for all your work and help with this. And as always, like when we're in a committee meeting, if you will please introduce yourself and tell us who you are with. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am Russell Moore, Director of the Comptroller's Office of Research and Education Accountability, or OREA. And I have with me Linda Wesson, the Assistant Director of the office, and also Lance Iverson, who is a research analyst with OREA. We are glad to be with you this afternoon to provide a broad overview of federal funding in K-12 education. We hope this opening presentation will help set the table for the presentations and the discussions to follow. It should help inform your thinking on the topic and will hopefully also inform questions you may wish to ask of other presenters that will be coming before this task force. I want to make a few general statements about OREA's role with the task force before getting into specifics. As always, OREA is committed to supporting the General Assembly by providing accurate and objective research. We recognize that to make good decisions, you've got to have good information, accurate information, objective information. And our main goal is to see that this task force is provided with such information and to provide useful research services and assistance to that end. Our presentation this afternoon is one form of assistance. We have other forms of assistance that we are planning on providing to the task force, and I will cover some of those points at the conclusion of our time this afternoon. Now for the specifics. As the opening presentation for the task force's work, we want to begin with a high-level overview of federal K-12 education funds, both from the perspective of the state and also from the perspective of local school districts. Our overview comes from data collected and reported by the U.S. Department of Education, which awards the federal grants, the Tennessee Department of Education, which receives many of the grants and is responsible for allocating most of this funding to districts and schools. The department must also meet associated federal requirements itself and help provide oversight of the funds. And also local school districts who budget for and spend most of the federal funding and who, like the State Department of Education, must also meet the associated requirements. Our presentation uses data from these sources to provide a high-level overview of federal funding. I'm going to turn things over to Linda now. Linda's portion of the presentation will take a look at the history of federal funding coming to the Tennessee Department of Education. Most of that funding is passed through to local districts and schools, and Linda will show how much of local districts' operating budgets are made up of federal funds. The main focus of her presentation, though, will be on the 5 biggest recurring federal grants for K-12 education. Linda?
Good afternoon. Here we go. Okay. This first slide shows more than 50 years of federal education funding in dollars received by the Tennessee Department of Education. The red line is the federal dollars. The total funding to the department is the blue line. And just like a big portion of state funds that are budgeted to the department get passed through to local districts as BEP or now TISA funds, a big portion of federal education funds that are allocated to the department flow through to the local districts as subgrants. The next slide shows the same data but with the federal funds as a percentage of total Department of Education funds. You'll notice a couple spikes, one in fiscal year 2010 and 11. That reflects the ARA funds during the Great Recession and Tennessee's award of the Race to the Top grant. And the spike to the far right for fiscal year 2022 reflects the various COVID relief funds awarded. For our high-level overview, we examined formula grants. Sometimes those are called entitlement grants that Tennessee and every other state receive from the federal government every year. These are like recurring funds in our state budget. You'll note the decline in the total from the 2022 allocation to 2023. That is primarily due to USDA, Department of Agriculture, reimbursements for school food programs. During the pandemic, the federal government was reimbursing school breakfast, lunches, and snacks to all students free of charge instead of only those eligible for reduced or free price meals. So what's not included in our overview are the one-time grants like COVID relief funds and some federal grants that go directly to the districts, that they don't flow through the Department of Education. Impact aid would be one example of those direct funds. Those impact aid, for example, is to federal grants that reduce the impact of lost property taxes in local communities that have federal facilities, like military bases, TVA, things like that. There are a number of general requirements for all the federal grants, and they're applied across the board regardless of which program we're talking about. There's always federal reporting requirements on program data and financial data. All the grants that flow through to the district, the department, and other agencies are responsible for monitoring their district spending. The comptroller's office is responsible for audits. There are also maintenance of effort requirements. Sometimes you hear this referred to as supplement, not supplant. That's basically whatever the state and locals are doing, they have to keep doing that. The federal money is supposed to be in addition. And all the federal programs are subject to Title IX non-discrimination requirements. So the bulk of federal funds come through the Tennessee Department of Education and are distributed to the local school districts, or LEAs. We have two maps to show what portion of the year-to-year operating revenues come from federal funds in each county. This first one is for school year 2018-19. So the darker shaded counties have higher percentages of federal dollars in their total current year operating revenues. And from the scale at the bottom, you'll see the low end of the range is at about 3%. That would be like your Williamson County, the very light blue in the center of the map. The top range was about 18%. Again, we're talking about fiscal year 2018-19. So that top range would be like a Campbell County up on the northern border or a Cocke County on the eastern border. The statewide rate in that year was about 11%. And I do want to mention that for simplicity, we combined data in counties that have multiple school districts. So you don't see the city districts and the special school districts within the county, but we did combine their money and their funds into the county data. We do have the individual district data. If you're interested, we can provide that. But just to get a general idea that was going on. This was obviously the last year before COVID, and we think probably more representative of the percentage of federal funds that districts typically receive. And the federal revenues mapped here include all federal funds, not just the formula grants. So this next slide is just a continuation. We're still in fiscal year 2018-19 before COVID. This chart just lists the counties with the highest and lowest percentages of federal revenues coming into their just their standard year-to-year operating budgets. Those with an asterisk are the counties with multiple districts where we combine the data. I will note that if you read through this list, you note that federal funds tend to be higher in districts with lower incomes or more rural areas, and they tend to be a lower percentage of school district revenues in more affluent areas. So the next map shows federal revenues as a percentage of districts' total revenues for 2021-22. The main difference is the scale. Whereas the previous 2018-19 map ranged from 3 to 18%, you notice this one ranges from a bottom of about 6% to the top of 31%. This upward shift in federal dollars reflects the large influx of federal COVID relief funds that were distributed through a variety of different awards, which you may have heard of: ESSER 1, 2, and 3, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Funds, American Rescue Plan. So the statewide rate for the school year 2021-22 was over 19%. Some districts shifted more than others in the percentage of federal revenues received. You see on the map Williamson and several other Middle Tennessee districts like Rutherford, Wilson, Sumner remain in that lighter shading, meaning that federal revenues were a smaller proportion of their yearly operating revenues. Others, like Campbell and Hancock counties or Lauderdale County on the west side of the state, remain in the darker shaded areas, meaning federal revenues were a higher proportion of their yearly operating revenues. The chart here, again, is a continuation for 2021-22, similar chart as you saw before, but just 3 years further on. We've gone through the pandemic and kind of almost out the other side. 4 of the top 10 counties were also in the top 10 for fiscal year 2019, meaning they depended more on the federal dollars. 7 of the bottom 10 here were also in the bottom 10 for fiscal year 2019. And as the COVID relief funds begin to expire next year, we would expect the percentage of federal funds to return to a percentage of district revenues closer to the 2019 total of 11%. Obviously, some districts will be above or below that, as the map shows with the darker, lighter, but we would expect it would go back more to a 2019 picture. So, as we mentioned earlier, we focused on the largest formula grant categories. And these 5 listed here comprise about 93% of Tennessee's 2023 federal formula allocations. And again, the formula funds are those recurring ones that the state gets every year. Title I is under the Every Student Succeeds Act, and that is the most recent authorization of an original 1965 law called Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA. You may remember No Child Left Behind. That was a 2002 reauthorization. So ESSA is just the most current reauthorization of this act. While there are several parts of Title I that generate funds, the largest is Part A for improving academic achievement with a focus on disadvantaged students. Part B specifically funds state assessments like TCAP. The Tennessee Department of Education tells us that districts spend a majority of their Title I funds on positions, so primarily additional staffing to help support those students who need more for their education programs, more supports. The requirements in Title I include both federal and state law, include requirements for academic standards, those annual state assessments like TCAP, and an accountability system for school performance. Federal law for these Title I grants also requires a comprehensive state plan for using the federal dollars, as well as district and school level plans. This next slide just shows the Title I funding by category. And again, the Part A is to support students from low-income families. Part B is to help with the state assessments that are required by Title I. Part C is to support children of migrants. And Part D are for prevention and intervention programs for children and youth who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk. The next big grant category is the IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This has requirements for that Individualized Education Program, or IEP, which is to set goals and lay out services for each student with disabilities. Tennessee state law mirrors many of the federal provisions for students with disabilities. Federal requirements for an IEP, for example, are woven into our new TISA funding formula, where the funding weights for students with disabilities are based on the hours of school services defined in those IEPs. The funding breakdowns in the chart, Part B totals, we've combined both the main grant that comes for K-12 schools and a smaller grant for preschool services that serves students ages 3 to 5. And comparing the funds that are passed through to local districts from IDEA and the actual expenditures for students with disabilities, we estimate that statewide, the federal funds cover about 1/5 of the total spending for these students. The Part C program under IDEA is for early intervention services, and that is not a strictly education program, so much as those early intervention and support services that will help very young children be better prepared when they do get to school. And these early intervention services are administered by the Tennessee Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities rather than TDOE. While it is required to provide these home and community-based services to children from birth through age 2, Tennessee is one of a handful of states that expanded services to children through age 3 last year, and this year, Tennessee is the first in the nation to have expanded services up until a child turns 5 or starts kindergarten. There are extra federal funds. This year's extra funding to serve those children up through age 5 is about $2.3 million. Those funds are provided on a year-to-year basis, and we did not include those in this chart. The next largest program is the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Child Nutrition Funds. The child nutrition grants were the third largest category of the formula grants in Tennessee's 2023 allocation, but they comprised the largest category in 2021 and 22 due to the changes in reimbursements during the pandemic. The top line on the chart includes funds allocated for the National School Lunch Program, the School Breakfast Program, Special Milk Program, and the After School Snack Program. These funds are distributed to school based on the number of meals served and whether those meals were free or reduced price, depending on students' eligibility. The second line of allocations is for state administrative expense funds. This is an annual grant that funds all the administrative expenses for 21 full-time staff employed by TDOE to administer school nutrition programs. 10 of those work regionally that support the local districts or the other food authorities. I will mention that we did not include in this chart, there's 2 other grant awards that the USDA awards to Tennessee through a formula, but they're only distributed to the local districts through a competitive application process. And that is a fresh fruit and vegetable grant and equipment assistance grant. Together, those 2 only comprised about $7 million out of the state's total federal funding formula for 2023. And as we noticed earlier, you see going across the years, there's a large drop in 2023 compared to 2022. And again, that was just when the COVID-19 public health emergency declaration ended in May of this year. So did the higher reimbursements for the breakfast, lunch, and snacks that were awarded because all students ate free during the pandemic. I will mention a number of schools and districts in Tennessee have implemented what's called the community eligibility provision for their child nutrition programs. You might hear that referred to as the CEP, and that is where all students receive free meals regardless of their economic status. They don't have to apply for that eligibility for the free and reduced lunch. Last year in 2022-23, 49 districts were operating under that community eligibility, and 27 other districts were operating partial programs where just some of their schools were designated for that program. So I just wanted to mention that. Title II is another ESSA grant program that supports effective instruction. Most districts used their share of these federal funds for professional development, for training for teachers, but other uses included recruiting, hiring, retention bonuses, and other strategies to put effective teachers in the classrooms. And then Perkins, the Perkins grant supplements what the state and local districts are already providing to support career and technical education programs. For those who might be older, we used to call these vocational education programs, but now they're called CTE. Most of these funds, again, are passed through to the local districts. In 2021-22, a total of $20.7 million in federal CTE funds flowed to the districts. and they spent about $264 million on CTE instruction for that year. So roughly, federal funds would cover an estimated 8% of the cost of that CTE instruction statewide. So in summary, this recaps the largest grant categories of the formula federal education funds that we've outlined. We've run through just the very top highlights of these 5 programs, but I did want to mention that bottom line. It says other programs, and just to let you know, some of the other federal formula grants that Tennessee gets are what's called Title III, which is primarily to help English language learners, Title IV for after-school programs and safe and healthy schools, Title V for rural and low-income schools. There's a charter school program and a Title IX program that primarily helps homeless students. And now I'll turn it back over to Russell for some closing comments.
Thank you, Linda. As I mentioned at the beginning of this afternoon's presentation, OREA is committed to providing useful assistance to this task force. Our presentation this afternoon is one form of this assistance. This task force is conducting a deep dive into the details of federal funding for K-12 education and the associated requirements. It's a complex topic with many complicated strands. We know this task force will be hearing from the Tennessee Department of Education and also from some local school districts, among other parties. The department and local school districts have a very detailed knowledge of this topic because they are directly and regularly involved in the allocation, budgeting, and spending of the federal funds, and in meeting the related requirements. We recognize that task force members are going to be presented with numerous data points, dollar amounts, figures, statistics, and so on. Much information will likely also be provided about the numerous requirements associated with federal funding. We want you to know we will be present throughout the remaining meetings and plan to take an inventory of the data presented, of the presentations given, of questions asked, and of answers provided. And regarding the answers provided, we are also available to assist the task force as needed in obtaining and reviewing those answers. We also plan to prepare a summary of the task force meetings and provide that to the task force. We are mindful that the task force has a deadline of January 9th in the new year by which to prepare a report of its work. And our hope is that such a summary of the meetings could be useful in preparing this report. Finally, we also stand ready to provide any other research services or assistance to the task force as it carries out its work. We'd be glad to take questions at this time. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. And to the task force, OREA is also going to be back on next week at the end because there are a number of questions I suspect that will come up over the next 10 days that we'll want you back to have. Before I open it up, let me ask just one question. When we talk about monies going to the local LEAs, do they all flow through DOE, state DOE, or are any directly distributed to those LEAs?
There are some...
Check your microphone.
Linda Wesson with OREA. There are some direct federal grants to the districts. I think I mentioned Impact Aid was one of those examples. There are several others. I don't have the list in front of me, but we could definitely get that for you.
All right, members, both sides. Oh, boy. What do I do if there's a tie? All right. Chairman Reagan, I think I saw yours first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just some questions for clarity and also for the record. You mentioned on the slide that contained the summary of 2023 funding allocations, other programs. You mentioned ELL, the English Language Learner Program, but you did not tell us what percentage is that program of the total number there. Do you have that?
I do not, but we might. So there, the Title III allocation in 2023 was about 8.3 million. I'll let you do the math.
I've got that.
I
Follow
can't
on,
do
please,
that in my
Madam
head.
Chair. Madam Chair, follow on.
You're recognized.
Thank you. Does any of that include funding that we have already approved for the University of Tennessee's Foreign Language Institute?
I have no idea.
Okay.
We would check on that for
Thank
you.
you.
We'll get an answer to that for you.
I'll yield the floor if you'll come back to me.
Senator Hensley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for this very informative presentation. And federal funds in 23 were 1.089 billion. How much was the total education funding for the state?
Do you have that?
I'm just trying to clarify, when you say the total education, total state funds, total of all education funding?
Well, the state funds, I suppose, plus the federal funds, that would be the total education funding, correct?
So, for at least 2021, 22, total revenues were 13 billion.
13 billion, so that's including the federal funds?
Including the federal funds.
So 13 billion and about 1.4 billion were federal funds.
The formula fund, there's more federal funds, especially in that year. What we put on our PowerPoint there is just the formula funds, the ones that recur year to year. There's a lot of one-time funds, especially right now because of COVID. So a lot of one-time funds, they're for, I say one time, they're not just 1 year. They might be for 2 or 3 years, but they start expiring, most of them start expiring next year. So those are gonna start disappearing. There are a number of federal discretionary funds that states can apply for if they're interested. They're not part of a formula that comes every year. They're just sort of one-time special projects, and we really didn't try to dig into those at this point.
Okay, and just one other question, Mr. Chairman. Back to the county percentages, is the difference in the county percentages because some counties put in more local dollars or because they have more students that qualify for the different programs, or what's the big reason for the different percentages in the counties?
Some of it could be all the things you mentioned. I would say typically what drives some of the federal funding is the poverty rates in the counties, because a lot of the federal funds are predicated on formulas, and so one of those formulas is how many low-income students, how many low-income families. Some of it is size, which would affect more the dollars than the percentage, like the number of students. So obviously a Shelby County or a Davidson County, Hamilton County, they get more federal funds because they have more students, but as a percentage, it doesn't work out that way. But you are correct that if your state or especially your local money was higher, then that automatically makes the federal funds a lower percentage.
So Williamson County by far has the lowest percentage because they have fewer low-income students?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Representative Slater.
For the Title I funds, you have a bullet point that states federal law for these groups also requires a comprehensive state plan for using federal dollars, as well as district and school level plans. Has there been any accounting of how much it cost to develop those plans, either at the state level or at the district level?
I
We're not,
was,
we're not aware of that, but that is a question of, the cost of compliance is a question that we've had, and we know that there are going to be presenters here from the Tennessee Department of Education and also from local school districts as well. And hopefully they can shine some light on that, but that is a general question that we have wondered about ourselves, is what is that cost of compliance at the state level? What is that cost of compliance at the local level for the planning pieces, but also the reporting and the other federal requirements? Because it is time spent on that. It is money spent on that.
Follow up?
Yes, you may.
Yeah, with the USDA grants, you reference that there are some administrative costs that go to, that are covered by the grants themselves. Did I understand that correctly?
correct, yes.
Are there other federal grants that cover administrative costs as well? I didn't see that anywhere else other than for the USDA grant.
Yes. In most of the ESSA programs, Title I, Title II, there is what they call a set-aside for state administrative money that they're allowed to keep, that they pass the bulk of it on. But like for Title I-A, I believe, they can pull out 1% for state administration. They have to pull out 7% for schools with special designations like priority schools and targeted schools, but then that 7% gets passed down to those designated districts, and they can keep a little bit of that. So yes, there are federal funds that cover other administrative costs. Same is true for IDEA. Some of it is hard to, USDA got a separate line on their chart, frankly, because that grant is a separate grant. The others are kind of more like paragraphs like this long that tell you how much you can pull out, but it's complicated. So we didn't try to fit it on a PowerPoint. But yes, there are a lot of other programs that have administrative, both at the state level, and then when they flow through to the districts, there might be a district administrative pull out some limited portion that they can keep before it goes to the individual schools. So, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
May I clarify, that's a gross number then? Those administrative fees are covered in the numbers that you have presented here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering, I don't quite know how to ask it, but in hearing from people that deal with that, the school lunch program, so you're saying now everyone is covered, or is that up to the district?
The community eligibility provision is up to the district.
Okay.
And they have to meet certain eligibility requirements. Not just any district can decide to do that. They have to meet certain eligibility requirements. Usually what percentage of their students are from low-income families. During the pandemic, they served lunches to everybody. So during that pandemic, that was free. Now it's up to the districts if they qualify.
Thank you. And one other follow-up. Is there a way, because sometimes when people reach out to us about things that trouble them, sometimes there seems to be a lot of waste of, if the food's on the tray but it's not eaten or anything, they have to throw it away. Is there a mechanism to see what that looks like?
I'm not aware of a reporting, and I don't know the details, so maybe there is and I just don't know, but the department or one of the local districts might have a better view on that.
All right. Thank you.
Senator Ackberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all so much for your presentation. So leading up to this task force meeting and the few that we will have this week, I wanted to make sure that I was completely clear the type of funds we're talking about. So y'all's presentation says that this accounts for 93% of all funding for education in this state. Is that correct?
No,
Okay.
no. We took a list of just the federal formula funds that were allocated to Tennessee in 2023. So not all the federal funds, just the formula funds. These 5 that we highlighted here, these 5 account for 93% of just the formula funds.
Okay.
So not the total.
So 93% of like TISA? TISA? Is that what you're saying? No.
No, not teasers. The,
I'll take it, Linda.
go ahead.
No, this is just of the federal formula funds. So TISA and the state and local is
Okay,
separate.
it's separate, okay. Okay, so so the funds that we're looking at right now, it helps those who are disadvantaged, disabled. It allows children to be able to eat at lunchtime, and it supports CTE and technical education. So some of the 5 most important things I think our schools are dealing with. I don't know if this is something that you all can answer, but if we were to if we were not to accept these funds, do you anticipate that we would take them from state dollars, or we take them from, or is that something that we would determine as a General Assembly?
I think that's probably something that the General Assembly would determine. That may be sort of a flip side of the cost of compliance that could be asked of the Department of Education and some of the local districts that are coming in is if federal funds were rejected or reduced, what would what would administration look like? What would that mean for you in terms of operations?
Gotcha.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so on each individual slide, you guys kind of, you all, I'm sorry to keep saying you guys, but you all outline exactly what this covers. Is it your understanding that regardless of where the funds come from, we will still have to perform and provide these services? Or is that not something you all can answer?
Well, I can say that some of these things are in state law. So IDEA is a easy example for me to cite, that the requirements to accept the IDEA federal grants, many of those same requirements are in state law. So even if you did not take those federal grants, those are requirements for every student to have an IEP and be educated in the least restrictive environment. That kind of thing is in our state law.
Thank you.
Following up, just a question on the slide that you had back on the board. Of those 5 that represent 93% of the formula funding, child nutrition is roughly 25% ballpark
Yes.
of that figure. Child nutrition comes not from USDOE, but from USDA, correct? Those other ones all come through USDOE, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify so that if there was a discussion on DOE funding, a quarter of that funding is not there because that's from USDA.
Right.
All right, thank you. Representative Reagan, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for clarity's sake here, I want to make sure all we've been talking about is pre-K or K through 12. There's no funds that we've discussed related to higher ed, correct?
Correct.
All right, some follow-up questions then, if I might, Mr. Chair. You've mentioned several titles here, but you neglected to mention Title IX. I know there's no grants associated with that, but they do have requirements, the Office of Civil Rights requirements for investigations and so forth. Do you have any idea on the cost of that? You mentioned cost of compliance.
Right. We do not have costs of complying with Title IX requirements.
Mr. Chair, if I might, in the cost of compliance category then, is there a mechanism to resolve disagreements or disputes that might arise between the interpretations of federal guidance versus how some state actors might interpret that?
I think there is a case in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals that's trying to do that, trying to answer that right now.
If I might, so there is nothing in existence right now that's a court case, correct?
Well, I'm sure there are multiple ways that the Department of Education can work with its federal partners to resolve conflicts, but if you're talking about Title IX conflict of interpretation, that specifically is in a court case right now, yes.
Wasn't just Title IX, but yes, thank you. Finally, a question for clarity on the record, and I know this, but there may be some that don't. You mentioned in one of your slides migratory children. Please put the definition on the record for that, please.
I do not have the federal definition with me, but we can certainly get that for you.
All right, well, I think that's important. That implies some things that people may be confused about. For example, those that are migrating across our southern border versus those that are just moving from job to job within the state and so forth. The other question I've got is essentially how many of these programs are dual task? You mentioned that there are state requirements and there are federal requirements, federal funding and so forth. Do we know how many of these are intertwined or are just purely federal?
Are there any that aren't, that are just purely federal?
I don't, I think we would have to follow up with that. I know there are multiple things that the federal programs require that we also require as a state, but I can't quantify for that for you at this point on all the programs.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We appreciate your presentation, and I look forward to hearing more information.
Representative Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Continuing with the child nutrition, you mentioned that some school districts are actually have something that they do to ensure that all kids get free lunch. What can you explain that again?
The community eligibility provision is a special program through USDA. My understanding, which is very high level and not detailed, is that there's a threshold of students that districts have to meet in terms of the percentage from low-income families. If you meet that percentage, I believe there's other requirements that go with it. But currently, the information we have from the Department of Education is, I believe, 49 districts have currently met the guidelines and are able to offer free breakfast and lunch without eligibility. It's just every kid in the school, whether they're eligible or not.
And do they receive the FDA child nutrition funds? They still receive these funds, though.
Yes.
What are they able to do with them, all with those funds, if they're not using them?
They're using them. My understanding of the child nutrition program, and again, some people that work with it daily probably can answer it more clearly, but I believe it's a simple reimbursement process. It's more of a block grant, and so districts report how many meals they served, submit that, and the money's drawn down to reimburse them for the meals they serve. So if they're serving all the kids instead of a portion of the kids, they just say we need reimbursement for more meals, and they are reimbursed that money through the Department of Education from USDA.
Okay. So we're talking about what it will look like to reject federal funds for education. But if we're talking about child nutrition, if we reject those funds, how will our kids eat? If they're getting the child nutrition money from the FDA, from USDA, how will they get that if we reject those funds?
I think that would be a question be probably best addressed to Tennessee Department of Education and the local districts that'll be coming, because they're dealing with this on a regular basis, on a daily basis, into the details. We looked at this from a very high level of how much federal funding is coming in through those federal formula grants and then what the requirements are. What we did not do is to explore the what ifs. And so the what if type questions, I think, they could be posed to the Department of Education, Tennessee Department of Education, and those local school districts.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Hensley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And still talking about the child nutrition funds, in 2022, there was 688 million, and then in 23, it was 278 million. So that's the difference between what it costs to feed every child and what it actually costs to feed the low-income children, correct?
That would be my understanding. I can't address that specifically. I don't know what else was involved because, I mean, during the pandemic, some schools were closed, so maybe it's not all the children, but all the ones that were in school. I don't know, but that would be an excellent question for the Department of Education.
But that went from, I mean, a pretty significant 688 million down to 278 million, and like you mentioned, that was a $400 million drop, which was actually more than it cost to fund the program in a regular year. But is this program administered through the same program as we get SNAP benefits?
No.
Through the state?
No.
This is a separate program.
Yeah, I think that goes, I think SNAP, and formerly known as food stamps, goes through Department of Human Services.
And do these students that qualify for a free and reduced lunch, do they typically qualify for SNAP benefits as well?
I think some of them do, and I think that's where that determining eligibility comes into play, because there is categorical eligibility, where if a child qualifies for SNAP, then they categorically qualify for some of the meal provisions. And so I think in terms of compliance and administration, it can be easier if you take someone's eligibility for one program and say, okay, if they're eligible for that, then they're eligible for these other things too. Does that make sense?
Yes. So, and I think a lot of them do qualify if they get Medicaid or if they get SNAP benefits or they get Families First. Yeah. I think they qualify as well. But generally, these children also have SNAP benefits at home as well, generally speaking.
I would generally think the lower the income the family they come from, the more likely they are to qualify for those programs. And I do know that categorical element is used as opposed to having them apply for the free and reduced price meals. They would just say, if you're eligible for SNAP, then you're eligible for this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. If we have other questions for Oria, they will make a return appearance next week. So, and I think you've got a couple of questions already. So, thank you very much. And while fiscal review is making, I'm just going to, not you, just its way up. So, to the committee, Chair Lady Moody and I have attempted to put together a program that starts at a 50,000 foot view macro and then obviously drills down. So I think thus far we're getting a good overall perspective of what goes on funding-wise in the state.
Thank you for joining us again today. And again, if you don't mind telling us who you are and who you're with for the record.
Thank you, Chair Lady Moody, Chairman Lumberg, members of the working group, Krista Lee Karsner, Executive Director of the Fiscal Review Committee. And today I am not going to speak specifically to federal education funding, but more so broadly about how federal funding is accounted for in fiscal notes for proposed legislation. So, first off, I just want to provide the statutory requirements for fiscal notes. The Fiscal Review Committee is required to provide a fiscal note on all general bills and resolutions that will either increase or decrease existing appropriations, state or local revenues, make some sufficient appropriations, or impact the fiscal liability of the state. And you'll notice that nowhere on there does it say federal funds, but because we do account for federal funds within our budget, federal funds play a huge role in the fiscal liability that the state incurs. So in looking at this, when we look at if federal funding will be impacted, we will look at the federal law that created the program or provided the authorization for the funding, the federal rules that regulate how those funds can be provided, withheld, if there is a penalty of a certain amount of funds. And we'll also look at the policies because that can influence how those laws and rules are applied. Typically, when we're looking at federal funds, it is grant awards for a specific need or program. This can be direct grants or pass-through grants. Several of the pass-through grants will go from the state to local or community organizations. Some of them can pass through between state agencies and departments. There will also be matching funds or maintenance of effort funds. So grants can require that the state or local agency provide a percentage of the total funding. It can also be a joint program, such as our Medicaid TennCare program, where for every dollar spent on the state level, we will receive a certain amount for federal funding for that. It can also be enhanced funding. We spoke about the OREA, spoke about the COVID funds. So within those COVID funds, there were enhanced funding if the state met a certain maintenance of effort. And so for the fiscal note, we would have accounted for any of those. In our analysis, there are some federal laws, rules, regulations that we know because we deal with them year after year with legislation. But sometimes it is a department or agency identifying the federal law or rule that may be jeopardized. We do require, if that's the case, we require the specifics of that law and regulation to be identified. We will research that and look at the requirements of that. Sometimes it is very specific. Sometimes it can be just a judgment call on our part. Because of our statutory requirements, we do try and calculate an impact if possible. There are some times where there will be a specific minimum penalty methodology within the rule, and we'll try and identify that for the legislature. Also, when it comes to fiscal liability, many times it is hard to determine if federal funds will be jeopardized, but we do need to note that for the legislature for your information while you're debating and determining how you would like to move forward on a piece of legislation. Also, several times legislation will call for the use of available federal funds because of certain requirements, or there may be application processes in which federal funds would be gathered. Sometimes we can't always identify a specific amount of federal funds, but we will try and identify if there are certain federal resources that could be used. So just to provide some examples, and these are kind of the three main types of fiscal note federal impacts that a member will see. First is just a general statement that federal funds could be jeopardized, the program which it could be jeopardized from, and the exact impact could not be determined. So for this piece of legislation, it was using unexpended TANF funds for an after-school nutrition program. And while generally that could fall under the broad requirements of TANF. Because there was no specificity within the legislation as to who would qualify, we could not determine if TANF eligible families would qualify and receive the benefits, and so therefore it could jeopardize federal funding if the feds did not agree that that was a reasonable source. Secondly, this was a bill that proposed a time frame in which certain DCS-related files had to be destroyed. And because of requirements under the Social Security Act, that destruction would lead to the State Department being out of compliance with federal regulations. Within Title IV-E, though, there is a minimum penalty. So we could provide you with that minimum penalty. So this is what would probably be the liability to the state, whether it could go more than that or result in the loss of total funding. And then finally, when we can quantify it, we try to. This was a TennCare program, which was expanding coverage. We had, the average cost per participant for the coverage, the number of participants, the average savings per participant of what the coverage would then result in for this pilot program. But because it was a TennCare program, we know exactly the percentage of state funds and the percentage of federal funds for that. I would say that a lot of this is unknown to us, and it is a judgment call on our part. We do try and work with the legislature as much as we can. There is a bill this past session where a department reached out to their counterparts at the federal level, provided the language that was proposed, and worked back and forth, and the initial language could have jeopardized federal funds, but they were able to work it out to where the federal government was fine with the language. It met the intent that the member was trying to, and it was not an impact. So we can do that if we're able to identify it, and so that's why I feel like it's important for us to provide this information to the legislature when we can. But I'm happy to answer any questions.
I'm looking.
Senator Hensley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So any of these education programs, if we cut out any of these, any one of these examples they were talking about previously, you would be able to quantify how much federal money we would be forfeiting?
Senator Hensley, I think it depends on how you would go about the language you would be using to get rid of the program. What would be the posture of the program if it's services that would continue going, or if you are just rejecting a certain requirement? I think that a lot of that plays into whether we would be able to quantify it or not.
So you would be able to, if we did away with some requirement, you would be able to quantify pretty close the federal dollars?
I think that we could look at the funding that we receive for that federal requirement, if there are penalties related to not providing or meeting those requirements, or if it is a total loss of funding as to how much that would be.
And when you talk about penalties, that's just the federal government withholding some funds, or is that them putting a fine on the state that we would have to pay extra?
It could be withholding of funds. It could be a repayment of certain funds that we've received and have to pay those back to the federal government, typically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Process question for you. When you see, because I loved your examples, when you get a piece of legislation in, and oftentimes those of us on the committee know we get a red line, a strikeout of what we're changing in current code. Is yours somehow cross-indexed to federal code and into the funding streams for that? I'm trying to figure out, because it seems like potentially every piece of legislation we file could have an impact And I'm not being sarcastic.
Chairman, so we, on the staff level, we will do a red line of our own to compare what is occurring. But depending on, like, with TANF, we know if a bill is going to impact TANF, so we can go to the federal regulations and requirements and see, you know, if it is changing a direct requirement that the state has to meet with TANF funds. Or with TennCare, we can look at our waivers and see what's approved or not been approved under those. So I would say, not say with everything, you know, and we have missed it at times. Anyone who was here in 2016 remembers that we missed a federal, jeopardizing federal highway transportation funds and had to come back in special session for that. So we don't always catch it, but we try to when we can.
I do remember that. So, Representative Reagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. We appreciate your attendance. Some quick questions related to federal funds. Many federal agencies will have a piece of legislation that empowers them to create rules whereby they do these things. Under the Uniform Administrative Procedures Act, there is a provision for disagreements and resolution of those disagreements. So when you're considering the possibility that we're going to lose funds, how do you take into account that this disagreement could be elevated and we wouldn't lose them? Is there any way you do that?
Chairman Reagan, we are just providing information that, you know, here's the federal rule. This bill could be determined to be in conflict with that federal rule, and if so, here's the result. But as you said, I mean, there are several times when we cannot specifically say, because of this, we will completely lose federal funding for this purpose. But it is our responsibility to point out that there is that liability to the state if that were to occur.
Follow-up. Well, one of the reasons behind that, as I'm sure my colleagues up here know very well, when we have a bill and it makes its way through the primary jurisdiction committees and gets to the fiscal committee, that fiscal note that's on there is frequently taken as gospel. And so if there is a resolution mechanism for disputes and you don't put that on there when you just say it could be jeopardized, that's very difficult to get across. Is there any way you could, say, expand that discussion on your fiscal notes?
Chairman Reagan, I mean, I'm happy to look at that and see if we can. I can tell you that there are plenty of times that the finance committees do not take the fiscal note as gospel. And there are several times when the legislature doesn't take our interpretation of federal rules and federal law that could be jeopardized as gospel. So I would disagree with you on that.
Thank you.
Any other questions, members? I see Senator Ackberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for your presentation. So I was here in 2016 when we got to have a lovely fall session, and I remember our tunnel was out of service, so that was even more fun. But I understand the importance of compliance with the regulations that are in place. I mean, the bottom line is, just like when we send funds down to cities, if we have certain requirements within our statute, we require them to abide by those. And so I've received fiscal notes I love and fiscal notes I don't love. But I do appreciate that it gives us a full awareness of what we're actually doing when we try and pass legislation. So you gave some examples in your presentation where funds will be jeopardized, but beyond the Department of Education, I mean, from every single department, there's possibilities if you are not complying with federal guidelines around those subject matters, you could lose funds, correct?
Senator Ackberry, I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's very widespread along all departments and agencies in the state, and also it's interconnected through agencies and departments.
Thank you. So it really is a slippery slope. If we look at education, then At what point are we going to talk about transportation? And then we're going to talk about health. And there's only so much money the state can fund without relying. I think about 30% of our budget comes from federal funds. So thank you for your presentation. I might have some follow-up questions, once we keep digging deeper. But I think it's important to note that you all try to keep us on track, right? Obviously, some things get missed, 2016, but the federal government is sure to let us know whether or not we're abiding, just like we're sure to let the cities know, because I'm from Memphis, and I know many a times when there was some issues around funding or their retirement plans, the state definitely came down quite aggressively, so thank you.
Well, you did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, as all of our folks have. Thank you so much for being with us today. Well, members, no other questions from anyone else today, right? Do you have any other? All right. Well, for the audience and anyone listening or looking in, we will be meeting tomorrow morning beginning at 9 a.m. in the same room, Senate Hearing Room 1. And members, is there any other further business for the committee? Seeing none, we stand adjourned.